When we read the Old Testament, is it fair to see Jesus in its pages? Let's find out.
What in the world is the author trying to do? What are they doing with the words that they choose?
Jesus is not explicitly in, or even most of the time implicitly in, the Old Testament. Now, if that statement makes you uncomfortable, that's good, and it means we have to have this conversation. We need to talk about finding Jesus in the Old Testament, or, as I'll frame it here throughout our conversation, not finding him in the Old Testament. The number one thing that people are always looking for when they read Old Testament stories is some connection to their own experience as Christians. And the easiest way to do that is to find some bridge from the Old Testament into the New Testament, or specifically from the Old Testament to Jesus himself. It's difficult for most people when they're reading the Old Testament to find some way to make, dietary laws or rules about calves and goats or the wars of Israel and find some way to make that applicable to their everyday lives. I understand that that's difficult, and I understand that that's challenging. But the answer is not to jump directly to Jesus, or to say that Jesus got rid of all those dietary laws. He did away with the requirements of goats and sheep and all of the other different things you're supposed to manage in an agricultural society. He's the Prince of Peace, and so we won't have the wars of ancient Israel. It's easy to jump to him. It's easy to make him the center of everything. And in doing so, then it makes it easier for us to bridge to our own context. Because we're Christians living after Jesus lived and died and rose again, it's crucial for us to be able to understand everything that we do and everything that we experience through the lens of Jesus himself. However, the Old Testament isn't trying to point us to Jesus that way. Instead, what the Old Testament is doing is it's painting a picture. It's telling a story that has a beginning and that it has an end. And the Old Testament tells the bulk of the story. In fact, very little of the story happens after the closing pages of the Old Testament. The vast majority of the story happens before Jesus shows up. In order to understand what the Old Testament is doing and how that ends up leading us to Jesus, though, we need to understand exactly what the story is about. It begins with a God who created the universe and set humanity ruling over this planet. It was a structure that worked because humanity lived in submission and obedience to God, and God, through humanity, ruled over the earth. When humanity decided to step out of that order, to chase their own autonomy, to become independent of their God, everything came crashing down. The created order rebelled against humanity, humanity rebelled against God, death entered into the picture, and everything fell apart. God, as the main character of the story, then set out to fix the problem. And the whole of the Old Testament is God's journey to offer to humanity chance after chance after chance to retake and regain what they lost in the Garden of Eden. How does that end up leading us to Jesus? Well, the key question in the Old Testament is this search for somebody who can take the throne that Adam and Eve vacated when they rebelled against God in the Garden of Eden. You see, they were given unmitigated rulership over the planet. Theirs was the job of caring for the earth, stewarding its resources, and ruling it as the unmitigated kings and queens of the planet. But when they rebelled, they forfeited that role. And in forfeiting that role, they ended up corrupting the entire program that God had set up for the entire earth to enjoy peace and harmony and the created bliss that he intended in the very beginning. What God offers, first to people like Abraham, and then to Abraham's children, and then to the nation of Israel, and then to Israel's kings, and so on and so forth, is the opportunity to retake Adam's throne, to reassume the role of ruler of the earth. But that comes with a certain set of requirements. And that's what the Old Testament ultimately reveals to us as we go through the story. As God's on this quest to find someone to fill Adam's shoes, one of the things that comes up over and over again is the inadequacies of the humans that God is working with to succeed where Adam failed. And because those humans aren't up to the task, God keeps offering them different ways and different chances to try and take the throne again, to try and rule the way that Adam was intended to rule. He starts with Abraham. He gives Abraham blessings and promises and says, I will bless the socks off of you and your family if you just trust me and submit to me and live in obedience to me. He's offering to Abraham and to Abraham's children the same relationship and the same possibilities that he offered to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. But Abraham, just like his father Adam, has significant character flaws. And so do Abraham's children, Isaac and then Jacob's 12 sons. All of them are corrupt in some way or another, and all of them is incapable of escaping the curse of Adam, the ultimate killer, death itself. Exodus introduces us to not just a family, but now an entire nation. The Hebrews become the very people of God. They become this democratized opportunity to take what Adam lost in Eden. And God creates a special relationship with the Hebrews. He gives them the opportunity to live in right relationship with him. He sets them apart from the foreign nations. He offers to them all the blessings that he offered to Abraham and to Abraham's families, all with the expectation that then the Hebrews, or the Israelites, collectively lived in such a way as to retake Adam's throne. But they failed too. That's how the story goes. And you can kind of relate to the agony and the misery of the main character, of God himself, as he's constantly offering humanity chance after chance to do what he designed them to do, to give them the opportunities that he gave Adam and that Adam and Eve forfeited. But at every juncture, they failed to step into that role. But over the course of the story of the Old Testament, we start getting a clearer and clearer picture of what it's going to take to reassert the rulership of Adam. We're getting a better and better picture of the kind of human that will be necessary to sit on Adam's throne. By the time that we hit the kings, first with Saul and then David and then the kings that come after, we can see there's a kind of shift. God's relationship, instead of being democratized to the Hebrews, to the Israelites, is now narrowed again to the king. And as the king goes, so go the people. And as the king's relationship with God goes, so goes the people's relationship with God. And there's an expectation in those narratives that God is working with a single individual and offering that one individual not just rulership over Israel, but also rulership over the earth. The chance to literally step onto Adam's pedestal and take his throne again. And that's where the Old Testament leaves off. It leaves off with this big question at the back of our minds of, can God ever find somebody who will replace Adam, who will retake Adam's throne? I grew up in the 80s and the 90s, and so I grew up with film cameras. And when you took a roll of film to get developed, you took in a roll of negatives. It was the inverse of all of the colors and light that the actual picture needed to be. And that's what the Old Testament is. It's a roll of negatives. It's a picture of Jesus, but in the reverse. We see everything that he's not supposed to be, and we see the lack that all of the human characters in the Old Testament have. And as a result, we can pretty easily imagine what the picture is actually supposed to be. And that is why when Jesus shows up in the opening pages of Matthew, we should be excited. He is true humanity. He's humanity as we have never seen it before. At least we haven't seen it since the doors of Eden closed so long ago. And that's what the Old Testament is inviting us into experiencing, is that glorious shift as we move from the Old Testament to the New Testament, to realize that this person, Jesus, is a different kind of human. We know what he's supposed to look like because we have been watching everyone fail over the course of the Old Testament. And so by the time we get to the New Testament, we should be saying, of course, this is exactly what we've been looking for, because we couldn't find it anywhere else. That makes the New Testament way more exciting, to be honest, because by the time we get to the New Testament, we should be depressed, we should be sad, we should be longing for someone to actually succeed where everyone else fails. And it heightens the tension and the drama of the story of Jesus, because when Jesus is tempted to rebel against his Father in the Garden of Gethsemane, we should be trembling. Everything we have ever seen so far in every human who has tried to take Adam's throne has pointed us to failure. But here Jesus succeeds. He succeeds where Adam failed and where all of his forefathers failed. And we don't get that drama if we spend the whole Old Testament trying to find Jesus in every single little passage. The point of the Old Testament is to show a massive need that only the God-human Jesus can fill. So as you read the Old Testament, don't ask the question, where is Jesus? Instead, ask the question, what is this showing me about the kind of human necessary to succeed where Adam and his descendants have failed? What is this showing me about the lengths to which God himself will go to replace Adam, to rebuild the thing that was lost in Eden. And then when you get to the New Testament, revel in the glory of the success of the new Adam, of Jesus walking on earth and living as no other human has lived before, not because he's 100% God, but because he is truly human. He is humanity as we were intended to be. Jesus does not make sense without the Old Testament, and Jesus does not need to be in the Old Testament to make sense of the Old Testament. The Old Testament is the very thing that paints the picture around Jesus so that when we arrive to Jesus in the story, we can say, yes, absolutely, he is the one we have been looking for, because we haven't found someone who can fit the need yet.
What in the world is the other? True